So as an organism gets larger in size, moving fluid around and getting oxygen to cells starts to become more and more of a problem. Things like diffusion, where oxygen diffuses in and out of cells, works well if things are very small, but as organisms get bigger, you need to start actually pumping things around. So that's where the heart comes into play. So this is a typical picture of a four-chambered heart that you would find similar to what you'd find, say, in a human. There are different versions of hearts depending on if you're, say, an earthworm or a frog, but we'll stick with this model here with a four-chambered heart as you see in a human. And the heart can be divided into four chambers, two atria, one on the right and one on the left. And remember, it's always, if this were your patient, this would be a picture with half of the heart cut away, and it would always be the patient's right side and the patient's left side. So not necessarily the right hand side of the board or the left hand side of the board, but the patient's right side of their heart and left side. So this person would be as if they were looking towards you. So the atria, two atria, right and left, this is the right, this is the left, take blood that has basically used up the oxygen. Although there is normally still oxygen left in the blood, they typically draw a blue color to represent what they call deoxygenated blood. But in fact, it's still fairly oxygenated unless something's going wrong, extreme exercise and things of that sort. But so what happens is, this is the vena cava here. The vena cava brings blood back to the right side of the heart. And then as the vena cava bring blood back to the right atrium, when the right atria contracts, it pushes blood through this valve here. This is the atrioventricular valve on the right side, and that pushes blood into the right side of the heart. When the right side of the heart then contracts, when the ventricles contract, which they do at about the same time, the blood comes up and it closes the atrioventricular valve and pushes the blood this way, and that then opens up what's called the semilunar valve on the right side. And it goes up this artery here. This is called the pulmonary trunk, which then branches into the right and left pulmonary artery, bringing blood to the lungs. And they draw it blue here to represent, again, what they call deoxygenated blood, because this is blood that is going to go to the lungs to basically dump off carbon dioxide and then pick up oxygen. It then returns back via the pulmonary veins. These are red, symbolizing oxygenated or fully oxygenated blood. And they are, once again, they are veins because they're coming back to the heart even though they're red. That then would go into the left atrium, and then as the left atrium contracts, it would push blood through the atrioventricular valves on the left side. Blood would go into the left ventricle. As the left ventricle contracts, it would come up this way. Once again, the atrioventricular valves close. Blood goes through this semilunar valve and then up the aorta. And the aorta is the main branch that goes to the rest of the body. When you listen to your heartbeat, say through a stethoscope, what you're hearing with what they call the lub-dub sound is the closing of the valves. So you hear two sounds, and they call it the lub-dub sound. And the first sound is the closing of the atrioventricular valves. So that's the lub part of the first sound. And then the second sound is the closing of the semilunar valves. So as the valves close, they create a sound, and that can be heard with, say, a stethoscope. Now, different kinds of medical conditions can happen with the heart. You notice, so here's the aorta. This is a view in which the part of the heart isn't cut away. And what you'll notice is these little tiny, fairly small branches that come off that aorta are parts of what are called the coronary artery. Coronary artery are arteries that bring blood from the aorta, oxygenated blood, to the heart. The heart, being a muscle, uses a great deal of energy, and it also needs oxygen. And so to beat and to pump, the muscle needs to go through cellular respiration, and it needs to produce ATP, and it does that by getting oxygen to the cells there. Well, if you get, because the arteries tend to be fairly small as you get over here, if you get a blockage in there and it blocks the artery, then everything downstream from that artery there could potentially not receive oxygen, and then that muscle tissue could die there, and that's what's called a myocardial infarction, or also called a heart attack. And a heart attack occurs when you have a blockage in a branch of the coronary artery that leads to muscle tissue death in the heart, basically downstream from that. Similar to that, you could have a blockage, or also you could actually have the blood vessel rupture, and that would be, if it was in the brain, would be called a stroke. So sort of functionally, you can have the same condition occur where you get a blockage, but instead of the blockage being in the heart, that blockage could be in a small blood vessel going to the brain, which could result in a stroke. What you could also get in a stroke, though, is you could actually have the blood vessels rupture because they're not surrounded by fat like the heart is. The blood vessels, which are very tiny, they can swell under high pressure and they can break, and you could get a stroke that way as well. So what ends up happening is your heart works together as a pump, and by controlling and regulating both your heart rate and your blood pressure, you can control the amount of blood flowing to different parts of your body. So normally you have a heart rate that is about somewhere near 72 beats per minute. If you're in really good shape and you exercise a lot, this number can be lower than that, but this tends to be the typical sort of standard number. Also, the standard sort of blood pressure number is about 120 over 80. Now what that means is 120 over 80 gives you two readings here. One's called your systolic, the other's called your diastolic reading. The systolic reading, the first number there, the 120, is the amount of pressure that is on your artery when your heart is contracting. So when your ventricles contract, they create a huge rush of pressure on the artery. When your blood vessels relax, there's still some pressure on the artery, and that leftover pressure that's still there is your diastolic reading. So your systolic reading can be thought of as the amount of pressure on an artery when your heart contracts, and your diastolic reading, the smaller number, the second number, is the pressure on the artery, usually measured like in your left arm when your heart is relaxing.